Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience. Cops of Reddit, what has so far been the creepiest call you've ever had to respond to and what happened? 1. Received a call from an elderly lady who had trouble breathing. I had taken several calls from her and her husband in the past, so I recognized her voice. I dispatched an ambulance to her residence and held her on the line trying to keep her calm while the ambulance was responding. Ambulance advises that they have 15-minute ETA, she lived in a very rural part of WV. I'm talking to her asking about her husband and how he was doing and just making small talk with her. The ambulance calls in and advises them they are on scene, and I let them know that she is in severe respiratory distress, and I still had her on the line. I let her know the ambulance was coming to the door to answer the door and she said okay and hung up the phone. Pretty normal, yes? Well, here's where it gets weird. The EMT and paramedic on scene call back about a minute later and advise no one is answering the door. We have a sheriff unit who was in the area pulling on scene about that time. The sheriff unit confirmed the address and advised him he was breaching the door to make access to the PT. 5 minutes go by and the paramedic on scene radios in asking who the caller was. I advise it was the elderly female who lived at the residence. He tells me that he's going to call in and needs to speak with the supervisor on shift. We get him over to the supervisor and the supervisor confirms the information that I gave him and asks what's going on. Apparently, the elderly female had been dead for a while and was already in full rigor mortis. They thought I was wrong on the caller, but the other dispatchers played it back and confirmed that it was the female who called. The ambulance transferred to the hospital, and we got the same calls and disbelief from the doctors. So, I got a call from a ghost. 2. I am interning with a sheriff's police department, so most of my time is spent on patrol. We got called out to do a wellness check which the deputy thought was going to be easy like she was out of town or something. We get there and are met by the neighbors who tell us that the mail is piling up in the mailbox and that there are several untouched packages on the porch. Okay, so we go up to the house and the front door is unsecure, so we crack open the door a couple of inches and the deputy calls inside, but the door won't move anymore. The house was one of those split houses where the stairs meet at the front door and the upstairs and downstairs are offset, so we concluded that there might be stuff behind the door. It's about this time that the deputy tells me that she is a known hoarder and that could be why the door was stuck. He also mentions that if we see flies on the inside of the windows she is most likely inside and deceased. As we walked around the side of the house we noticed a lot of flies on the windows. The back door was locked and as we looked in we noticed bags on bags of garbage diapers and other things all over the place. We head back to the front and attempt to make an entry. He pushes the door open, this time with more force, and from underneath I see grease-like liquid spreading out from under the door. The deputy stops, closes the door, and calmly tells me that the lady was indeed dead, and wedged behind the door. From the dates of the packages, we concluded that she had been gone for about 2 months. Once we did enter the house I was allowed inside. After 2 months she didn't even look like a human corpse. Her skin and body had sagged and melted to the floor and her face was all black and had been eaten to the bone by maggots. I'll never forget the smell when the corners moved her, and she popped. It was like a physical presence. Whatever those people get paid to deal with that, it's not enough. The thing that really got to me though, was wondering if she had fallen down the stairs and died there, or if she fell and was unable to move and waited for help that would never come. 3. Went to a welfare check. A neighbor called in and said he hasn't seen this guy for a few days and the lights have been on for a while. I go and look around and find no footprints or tire marks in the snow, recent storm. I checked the garage and nothing. I checked the house which was unlocked and found the guy's cell phone, keys, wallet, and cash with the TV on. That's when I realized this was now a dead body search. I looked everywhere in and outside the house and around the garage. There were several old junk vehicles on the property but again, no tire marks or shoe prints or anything. I called all recent numbers on his phone, and no one's heard from him. Only so much I can do, so I issue a BOL and we start getting NCIC paperwork ready. Next day the day shift officer goes over to follow up. Turns out, the guy was plowing his driveway and either had a medical condition or something and either passed out or died on the spot and crashed the truck onto the other junk cars, which then caught on fire. Edit, investigation leads to the fact this happens a week before I got this call, leaving only a pile of bones in the front seat covered in snow. I felt very upset for not finding him that night, but it was really creepy knowing his remains were inches away from where I was searching. 4. I'm not a police officer, but my dad just recently shared these stories with me. My grandfather was a police officer in a small town in the 60s to 70s. Late at night it was common for officers to pull over vehicles driving through town, especially if they didn't recognize them. He pulls over a bus load of people. He walks through and asks them where they are headed, yada yada. They were headed to California. It was Charles Manson and his group. Another story. Same grandfather, same stop, a car passing through protocol. Asked the driver where he was headed, BSD for a while, and told the guy to have a nice evening. A few towns over, guy gets pulled over again, shoots and kills the police officer. Apparently he was doing this as he drove along, got pulled over and shot the police officer. When they questioned him he said he had been pulled over by my grandfather, but he was such a nice guy he didn't kill him, but he did have the gun sitting in his lap. 5. I was called out to negotiate with a 17-year-old female who had barricaded herself in a bathroom with multiple knives and scissors. She'd done it right too, so what ended up going through the sheetrock wall. She wouldn't talk with me at all but had multiple graphic conversations with her mother, who committed suicide 3 years earlier, and her dad, who's serving lots of years in prison for sexually abusing her. When SWAT pulled her out she had completed multiple circumcisions on herself with the scissors, completely cut her nipples off, and had sodomized herself multiple times with multiple steak knives. The kicker was, she was talking the whole time and her tone or volume never changed. The pain never bothered her. Or, more likely, she never felt it. The human mind is scary. 6. Had an open line of a guy yelping ow, in between thud noises. He didn't respond to anything I said. Turns out, those thuds were the sounds of him chopping off his fingers with a meat cleaver. Had a Good Samaritan call about a guy pulled up in front of a medical center in his car. He had a travel blender plugged into his vehicle and he was bleeding heavily. He had chopped his dick off and put it in the blender. I forget the specifics as to why, but it had something to do with a pending child molestation or rape case. Last but not least, the one that will stick with me, is the woman who called at around 8 in the morning on a Sunday telling me, in an eerily calm voice, that she had killed her baby by bashing his head into the floor because the devil was inside him. I didn't believe her. It was true. Edit, I didn't believe her as in, I didn't think she really harmed her children. 7. Got a report of a missing husband. He told his wife and family of 6 children that he was going to get his tires changed, but never returned, and this was 12 hours ago. They had purchased another house in a neighboring community, and the relationship with the wife was under pressure, so the wife assumed he was staying at the other house, and claimed he would never kill himself. The strange thing about this report though was that he emptied his personal bank account into his wife's this morning as well. The wife explained this off saying that they recently had a fight about finances, and he agreed that he was bad at money and maybe they should just have a joint account that she controls. On a hunch, I asked his 14-year-old boy if there were any areas in the mountains nearby that his father enjoyed going, and the son identified a road about 10 miles away. It was nearing midnight, but I decided to drive to the top of this old and abandoned Forest Service road. As I drove through the snow and started to climb the road, I felt a gut feeling that I would 100% find this guy up there either thinking about or already acted out a suicide. The snow-laid gravel road had some signs of travel, but no real indication of how fresh the vehicle tracks could be. As I reached the top of the road after an hour of travel, I was honestly surprised that I did not find his black truck. I spent the drive back down thinking about gut feelings and how they are unreliable, but I somehow felt different about this one. As I traveled up the road, I did notice over a dozen smaller roads branching off, but they were not mapped, and I had already spent too much time on a single occurrence in a busy city with too few police officers. Nonetheless, I decided to check a single of these secondary roads, and about 3/4 foot of the way down I picked a road at random to check, and sure enough my headlights lit up the back end of a black truck about 100 yards past the first corner. Even if I hadn't memorized the license plate beforehand, I wouldn't have had to run it, it was clearly his. I radioed that I had found the truck, parked my vehicle, and traveled 20 feet to his truck with my heart beating like I was doing it at a sprint rather than a normal walk. What I found inside was a mess of brains and blood caused by a self-inflicted shotgun wound under the chin. I'll save you from the description. There was just something about that gut feeling while traveling this abandoned and quiet mountain road, followed by a sense of being tricked by the gut feeling, then finding out it was true by discovering such a gruesome scene, having to wait 3 hours next to his truck waiting for body removal, and then to end it all by having to go to the family who was expecting good news to deliver to them the worst news possible. That makes me feel creeped out to this day. 8. I responded to a report of an unresponsive infant. When I arrived, all the family members were standing around casually in the front yard pointing into the house. I found the baby in the back room lying on her back on a bare mattress. I started CPR, but realized the baby was probably already deceased. We rushed her out to the arriving ambulance hoping they had a way to bring her back. I learned she was the mother's second suspicious SIDS death, and I had her other children removed from her care. The difficult part was when I left the scene and went to the ER to see what came of the situation. As I walked in and asked where she was, an ER nurse walked over to me and handed me the deceased baby swaddled in a blanket and told me to wait for someone to show me to the morgue. So, I'm standing there in the ER in uniform holding what everyone thinks is a live infant, but rather, an infant corpse, and several people stop by wanting to see her and commenting on how cute it is to see an officer holding a baby. I just smiled, but it killed me inside. I was ushered back to the morgue after what felt like an eternity, and told I had to wait with the baby until the medical examiner arrived. They took the blankets off and laid her on a stainless steel gurney and left me alone with her again. I lounged around the morgue for about an hour waiting. By the time I got home several hours after the end of my shift, because this call came out 15 minutes before the end of my 10-hour shift, I laid down on my bed and cried for a long time. My young daughter was in daycare, and my wife at work. I really needed to hold both of them, so the house felt incredibly empty. My daughter was only slightly older than the infant, and when I was looking at her earlier, I kept seeing my own daughter. I didn't get any sleep at all before going back in for the next shift later that night. 9. My dad worked in a precinct with one of highest crime rates in NYC. I think it had the highest murder rate during his years on the job. Anyway, he won't tell us stories about what he's seen because they're mostly horrific and still give him nightmares almost 15 years off the job. However, I do remember he told us one story when he was really drunk. A woman in her 20s walked into her apartment building late from work one night and was waiting for the elevator. It opened, and the only person in there was a creepy-looking guy. Though apprehensive, she got in and pressed her floor number, but noticed that the basement button was pressed. Normally after 9 p.m. maintenance would lock the basement button to prevent random people from going down there. I guess someone forgot to lock it. The creepy guy ended up taking her down there, tying her up, and raping and torturing her for hours. He then took her apartment key, went up to the floor she'd pressed when she'd first gotten into the elevator, tried every door until he found hers, and took her roommate, also a woman in her 20s, into the basement where he continued torturing and raping both of them until dawn. Maintenance found them that morning, and my dad was a responder. Again, my dad never told us stories. This one might have stuck out because he has 4 daughters, but I think it's got to be up there in creepy factor. 10. My father has been an officer for 20 plus years and this story is probably the worst thing he has ever had to do. My father and I were heading to the range one day to sight our hunting rifles. We were in his police vehicle since we were going to the shooting range for local law enforcement personnel. Dispatch came over the radio to get an officer out to a 911 call of a possible dead body. Many of the officers joked over the radio that it was probably a prank or someone overreacting since it was around Halloween. The responding officer arrives at the scene and calls in that he is going into the woods to investigate. A few minutes later he sends out a call confirming it's an actual dead body and to get the necessary resources sent out to assist. Then the responding officer personally called my father because he recognized the body. It was my dad's brother. He had been having rough times and decided to end it by hanging himself from a tree 50 yards into the woods next to railroad tracks. The second worst part was that he had been reported missing for a few months. So, by the time they found his body he was severely rotted. The worst part was that my father had to go to assist in the removal and scene investigation. That day was the first time I ever saw my father cry, and I was in my mid-teens. 11. My department sends an officer to all rescue calls if one is available. We got a call late one night to assist rescue at a townhouse complex for a woman hemorrhaging. We didn't show up until rescue had already left with the patient. So, we let ourselves into the residence and eventually found the bathroom, which was covered in blood. Blood on the walls, all over the toilet, everywhere. Crazy amount of blood. Rescue hadn't mentioned anything suspicious on the radio, so this was surprising. We were preparing to leave when one of the younger officers noticed bloody footprints leading to the front door, and then across the parking lot, to a dumpster. We gathered at the dumpster, lifted up the top, and lit up the interior with our flashlights. Same officer extended his baton, reached into the dumpster with it, and brought out a bloody plastic grocery bag. With a dead baby in it. True story. 12. Detention officer at a local jail here. We had a guy get brought in about 2 a.m. one night who we immediately knew was about to give us a fun time based on the way he was moving, quickly snapping the head back and forth, looking all over the room, etc. One of my co-workers and I stay with the booking officer to help her out when it inevitably hits the fan. The guy keeps rambling on throughout the entire process. Parts of his speech are understandable, but most of it is gibberish. At one point he looks up at my coworker and says, "Would you blame me for it?" Trying to keep the guy calm, my coworker tells him, "Nah, man, no one can blame you." For whatever reason this sets the guy off. He leaps off the bench and we both push him back down. My coworker is trying to get handcuffs on his other wrist. He was already handcuffed by one hand to the bench, and I'm holding him against the wall with every bit of strength I have. This man was strong. I swear the bench was about to come up off the concrete when he first leapt at us. Once my coworker gets handcuffed on him, we take a step back. The guy throws his head back, eyes rolled all the way back, and lets out an inhuman scream that I've only heard in movies about demon possession. He then moves his head as if he's looking around the room, but still with his eyes rolled into the back of his head and spouts off more nonsense. I'm not Catholic, but I was very tempted to cross myself. The screaming, head throwing back and eye rolling continue on for about 45 minutes. Every so often he'd come back to reality and talk to us like a normal person for a moment and then go back into crazy mode. 13. I was new on the force and sent to a home invasion in progress late in the night. I noticed my training officer didn't seem to be too concerned and responded slowly as opposed to the normal emergency response for crimes in progress. Upon arrival he asked me if I had been to the home before. After I said no, he told me to go handle the call. As I walked towards the home, the garage opened and an elderly lady who was bent at a 90 degrees angle at her waist hobbled out. Without looking at me, she said to hurry due to the fact that the two black male suspects were still in the home. She used much more colorful and racist language. I noted that she couldn't straighten her back and realized she was a bit off mentally. I then walked into the home with her behind me. While my eyes adjusted to the interior, I heard a click. I turned to find the lady locking two padlocks on the interior of the door. I then noted, as we were within the kitchen, that every cabinet and pantry also had a secured padlock on their doors. I looked down the hallway and found that every interior door of the small home was shut and secured with padlocks. I followed the elderly woman down the hall to the second door on the left. She began to unlock the padlock to the door and shouted, "They are in here." To my surprise, within the room, there was an older white guy sitting at a table using a desktop computer. He looked at me, greeted me, identified himself as the woman's husband, and then went back to whatever he was doing. The woman then pointed at an empty chair and began to yell, "They are under the chair." Oh no! They just ran outside right there. The woman was pointing at a wall. After waiting for the woman to lock her husband back into the room, and then waiting for her to let me out of the kitchen door, I cursed my training officer and hightailed it out of there. That was my first exposure to mental illness, and it was creepy. My training officer said the woman had supposedly been raped by 2 black males years ago, which had caused her mental break and her animosity towards those of the race. 14. I was a parks officer for a downtown metropolitan out in the Pacific Northwest. I saw my fair share of weird stuff on my 1700 to 0100 shift. Naked bike ride after party at midnight with about 1,000 or so naked people chilling out, the occasional couple having sex, homeless person masturbating or shooting up heroin, and the occasional dead body were all a normal part of the job. Anyways, this one night we were sent to investigate a tent set up relatively near the waterfront, which was generally a homeless person that was trying to stay dry for the night. So, we get there around 23:30 and tell the lady inside that she has to go a few hundred yards away to an area that isn't patrolled. She fusses about having to move, then mentioned a man living in a cave at the bottom of a shallow ravine nearby that's been killing small animals and eating them. We asked her for more information, and she points to a general area about 50 yards away through some thick brush, the general area most people wouldn't wander past. My partner and I start to walk through the thick brush with just our flashlights and eventually stumble upon the ravine, and sure enough there is a small opening on the side enough for a person to fit in. I scale down about 20 feet and peek inside the opening and see what seems like a massive pile of magazines, torn pages, articles of clothing, a sugar cookie tin, a gorilla costume hand, some crude-looking tools including a makeshift bow, a few knives and other generally weird. Being curious, and that the cave was empty, I opened the sugar cookie tin and found a large amount of what seemed like raw animal meat. At this point I was thoroughly freaked and decided to unask the area and inform the police of what I had found. We didn't carry weapons. We never found out what came of the guy who was staying there or what was going on there. But definitely freaky at around midnight in pitch black conditions. 15. Not a cop, but my dad's friend is, and got totally hammered at our house a few days ago and told us about one of his first rough calls was a little girl who had come to school with hair missing from her head, and apparently her dad abused her and ripped it from her head, who knows how and why, and so police got involved, and when the parents didn't come to school they went to the house and found the mom so badly bloodied and with both eyes so swollen she couldn't see out of them. Her daughter couldn't even recognize her. Dad had apparently not wanted her to go to school because he knew teachers would get suspicious, but mom sent her anyway. He woke up in the morning and found out she had sent her and just went on her. Dad had locked himself in his room upstairs. He jumped out the window and made it pretty far, until he ran into a K9 unit and tried to make a run for it, and the K9 tore his legs to shreds. Never been so happy to hear the man got what he deserved. Not a happy ending for the girl though. Update, while this blew up a bit. My little sister goes to school with the girl, and there were assemblies at school to raise awareness for domestic and child abuse. She is still in care of her mom, and it turns out she's pretty normal. It's just that her dad devolved into deep alcoholism and is pleading guilty to several different charges. 16. Military police officer, so I worked both law enforcement and corrections for a bit. In corrections the head office was also the police services desk. Often it would ring, and no one would be at the other end. Anyways, one time it rang, and instead of a number it had a descriptor that I don't remember exactly. Something like emergency phone 11. I was new and immediately called my superiors about it. They told me to drop it and never report anything like that again. Ominous, right? Anyways, the reason I told that is to tell this. Sometime later, on patrol I got dispatched to essentially an abandoned side of the base to respond to an emergency phone call, no location at first because radio didn't know where emergency phone 11 was and was new to the base, so we didn't get the same memo to not report those calls. The radio then went on to say that the caller had sounded frantic and thought they were being chased, meaning that someone had actually been on the other end. The radio eventually digs up some old maps that label an emergency radio 11 location and relays them to me and my partner, so we drive there in a hurry. There is no phone, just a broken pole where one had once been. That was a fun one to report. 17. Ex-cop. I worked in a high-tech task force agency conducting computer forensics investigations. Lots of child porn. Lots. Anyways, we were doing a multi-agency search warrant sweep in a large metro area in California. We serve a search warrant for distributing/possessing CP at a residence in a semi-decent area, and the suspect fit the prototypical Hollywood child molester look. He lived with his disabled wife, no kids, and she had mobility issues, mostly stayed downstairs, and had not been upstairs for years. We go upstairs, and this guy has a legitimate masturbation station set up in one of the bedrooms that had an outside padlock on it. It was dark, the windows were covered, and he had baby dolls with their tails cut out all over the room and some of their mouths cut out for impromptu baby sex doll. Some of the heads were removed and scattered on the floor. This guy had serious issues. 18. Man, this was probably 2010, 2011. I was really new. Call came as an unknown problem, basically 911, even dispatch didn't know what to call it. Turned out this guy had just murdered his stepfather and then walked to his grandparents' house to kill them as well. He stabbed his grandmother through the eye with a Rambo-style Bowie knife, one that had the compass in the pommel of the handle. He missed her brain by about 1/8 of an inch, so she did not die. Instead, she came running out of the house when we got there, a knife sticking out of her eye, and the compass was spinning around because she was moving. My brain literally went "that's not real," and I went past her, along with several other police officers, before the sergeant was like, "What in the actual fuck are you guys doing?" She survived. We caught the guy in a stroke of pure luck. Elderly woman with a massive hunting knife for an eye, definitely the creepiest thing I can remember seeing. 19. Working third shift on Halloween night, I'm out by one of our smaller lakes just outside the city limits. Kids love to go out and drink, which is surrounded by some nice houses. Going through the neighborhood, each of the roads ends at a small 2-lane road that surrounds the lake. I'm slowing to the stop sign and already starting to look to my right to make the turn when my headlights start tracing the rock wall that surrounds the lake. I catch something out of the corner of my eye in one of the large trees that dots the walk path. I backed up to see what it was, and I saw a guy hanging. At first I thought it was a Halloween decoration. The neighborhood is really into decorating for every holiday, so I stopped, got out, and as soon as my flashlight hit him I realized, nope, no decoration, he dead. As I'm standing there getting ready to call it in, I notice a gaggle of kids coming down the street trick-or-treating. Shit, as soon as they see my car, they start heading my way faster, so I took it back up the block to meet the parent walking with them and tell her she needs to take the long way around the block the other way. She can see it on my face, I'm not kidding. Turns out he was a 20-year-old that was devastated about his girlfriend breaking up with him, and she lived in the last house on that block where she would see him the next morning when she looked out her window. 20. UK, got called to assist ambulance at an address because they were struggling with a woman who'd had an apparent seizure. We got there and she's this tiny skinny little Singaporean lady who's being held down on the floor by a paramedic. She's hissing and struggling against her and repeatedly trying to bite the paramedic. Her eyes are all black and red, not white. It takes me, 200 pounds, my partner for the evening, 180 lb, plus 3 paramedics to hold her down. All the time she's struggling and trying to bite with veins popping out of her neck. She's looking past us at the corner of the room screaming at something that isn't there, telling it not to kill her and us. Her husband, who seems weirdly unfazed by the whole thing, tells us this has been happening since she last went to Singapore and got sick after visiting a holy site. Usually, her sister has to stop it by putting this powder on her forehead in a cross, but unfortunately she's out of the country. In the end she was taken to hospital for a mental health assessment by the paramedics. I often wonder what the outcome was, but have no way of finding out, unfortunately. 21. Not a police officer, but a correctional officer in Texas. One time a guy slit the forearm side of his elbows, where it bends. He lay there in a big puddle of his own blood. I was one of the responders that day. I'll never forget it. As soon as you entered the cell, the smell just hit you. Blood has a strong metallic smell, which I never realized before. He'd been laying there a while, so the blood had coagulated, which again, I did not expect. As we lifted the barely conscious guy out of the blood fell off his body in chunks, like jello. It was pretty disturbing because I didn't expect any of it, nor was I able to mentally prepare for it. We're not really medically trained, so all of it was completely surprising to me. 22. Ex-military police here. Responded to a call of a woman with blood between thighs in t-shirt screaming in the yard. I'm first to arrive. She was the wife of service member, raped brutally. Was notified en route that there were also 3 dependents in the house. Unknown ages, but under 18 years old. Get wife on the ground, backup arrives, ambulance is en route. I proceed to enter the house with my sidearm drawn. Service member is unconscious, living room floor, pool of vomit around his head. 2 children holding themselves on the couch, in absolute terror. I gather up the kids and take them outside with the mother. The situation is surreal and I'm completely over my head. I re-entered the house. The state of it was hellish. Like a bomb of cigarettes, alcohol, maggots, diapers, and rotting food had been detonated. I have to find a 3rd dependent, stop and check if the service member was alive, had pulse. Make my way to the back room. There is a crib. No noise. I try to mentally prepare myself to see a dead baby. I approach the crib and see the baby asleep. I can see chest raising and lowering, partial relief. Dried poop encrusted the backs of its legs, butt, and back. The baby had not been bathed in some time. Virtually abandoned. The ambulance is now outside. I demand someone to get the infant. The base ombudsman woman arrives. She panics. I called my supervisor, who was on leave. Told him to get to the scene as fast as possible. My aspirations of continuing a career in law enforcement after my enlistment ended right there. 23. Got a call that someone wasn't answering their phone or the doorbell. We got to the house and noticed that every window was blinded by either curtains or pieces of paper. We rang the doorbell and yelled through the letterbox, but there was no answer. We opened the door and went inside. In the house it looked like someone had just had lunch. There was bread on the table and juice or milk in the glasses. Children's toys scattered all around. Then I saw a note that gave me the chills. It was a suicide note. As the door was locked from the inside, the person had to be in the house. We checked room by room and my heartbeat was at 300% when I checked the bathroom. Preparing myself for slit wrists or throats, I opened the door slowly, but there was nothing. Finally, one more room left, which was the attic. We walked slowly up the stairs, and we found the resident there, hanging from a beam. I will never forget the adrenaline I had, the scene in the living room or the resident I found. 24. Christmas morning 2004. The police station received an odd call from another station 600 km away, saying that a young man in his late teens had handed himself over to them claiming that he had shot his grandmother the night before, and drove all the way to the coast, Johannesburg to Durban. I was the detective on call that day, and since there was no immediate police van in the area, me and my partner had to go check it out. When we got to the address, we found a locked house with no answer. Knowing it might have been a prank call, I started walking around the house looking for an open window or some kind of evidence to support the call, not wanting to blindly break down a door based on a phone call alone. So, I managed to pry open a bedroom window, and what I saw inside gave me chills still today. It happened to be the master bedroom, and there inside, looking right up at me, was a bloodied face with big, bewildered eyes. Broke down the door and found the lady in her bed, still alive. She had been shot in the head the day before by her grandson who was living with her, and somehow managed to not die and instead, just lie there helpless, her bedroom TV blaring in a foreign tongue. She was a French immigrant. The whole house reeked due to her soiling herself, and while waiting for the ambulance to arrive I used some of her perfume to spray the room so I could do my investigation, but that just made it worse. The smell of perfume fused to form a smell that I would never forget. It was a common perfume, and from that day on it was hard being around anyone wearing it. It would trigger the accompanying smell, which in turn would conjure those eyes, pleading for help through the bedroom window. She died later that week in the hospital, and the grandson was charged with murder. He had shot her with a .22, stolen the neighbor's car and made his way to Durban. On his way there, being overcome with guilt, he decided to hand himself over. Boy, did I have an interesting story to tell the family at Christmas dinner. 25. My dad was a Chicago police officer in the 60s/early 70s, and two stories stick out, one creepy, one just pucker factor. Creepy, he and his partner get a call from neighbors to a frequent flyer domestic dispute at a rundown apartment building. They arrive and, of course, the lights aren't working in the stairwell. They head up to the apartment and, when they get there, they open the cracked door and the kitchen looks like a horror movie. Blood everywhere, surrounding one very obviously dead guy in the middle. Countless stab wounds, slit throat. He used the phrase, "It looked like a bear had ripped the guy's neck apart." Quick check of the lack of pulse and clear of the apartment later, they walk out and see bloody footprints heading further up the stairs. Head up, turn a corner and see the woman standing on the next landing, covered in blood, holding the knife at chest level, point up in front of her face and just staring blankly at them. She was basically catatonic until they transferred her to the mental ward, after which his interaction with her stopped. Pucker factor, he and his partner worked New Year's Eve and were assigned to the hospital. They were standing outside in a trailer that had been set up for triage, just casually chatting away, when a bullet plinked through the roof of the place and landed between the two of them. They decided then was a good time to go hang out with their friend the pathologist, who was working in the basement morgue. Better to be hanging out with dead guys than be a customer.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.